Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David McCann, and I'm joined today by Dr. Juliette Tobias-Webb. Juliette is a PhD, or holds a PhD, from the University of Cambridge in experimental psychology. She's been a lecturer at the University of British Columbia and at the University of Cambridge, and her topic has been around judgment and decision making. She's worked with the Australian Behavioural Insights team. She's worked with Ogilvy Change in Australia. She's worked for the Commonwealth Bank and their Behavioural Insights team, or sorry, Behavioural Economics team. And today, she's a superstar of STEM. So, Juliette, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have a talk with you today about this.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited to be here and hear your questions.
No, it's a fascinating subject area, and I think the one that I remembered and that I actually had wanted to ask you about was I had read about a type of testing experiment where they asked girls, young girls, I think that in this case the girls were 6 to 10 years old. They asked girls just to identify themselves. So standard like write your name and write your gender and maybe something else about a language you spoke. And what they found was if a young girl was made to reflect on being a girl by writing I'm a girl on a test, that impacted her performance. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is research about that. So it's called stereotype threat. And it can happen to anyone. So if you fit into a certain stereotype and you think about that stereotype, you can start acting or performing like that stereotype. So when we're thinking about young women or young females, it is that, say we're notorious for not being good at math. If we believe that going into a math test, then that can inhibit or impair our performance. And there is research to suggest that. There is also research now that is coming out that actually men and women are equally as good as math. It's just our beliefs or expectations that differ. So if we can change those expectations or beliefs or the stereotype threat, uh, then we shouldn't always see these differences in performance.
So a theory that I'd had to maybe bounce off you was, is it or could it be as simple? Now, obviously, it won't fix the whole problem, but what if you just didn't ask the gender question at all? Would that help?
Uh, when you're saying in what type of scenarios?
So in that same testing stereo, so you talk about stereotype threat. So the using a U.S. example, if you say, what's your ethnicity, and you're, let's say for example you're East Asian, and the stereotype of East Asians is that they're good at math. So you can suggest that because you're identifying with this group, that results then will be influenced just by that. So in that same way, if I don't ask a young girl and I avoid that stereotype threat, could it just be as simple as not asking the question to improve her test performance?
It could be. I think it depends. So, and what I mean by that is a lot of these biases are ingrained in us from when we're young. So there may be gender differences from biological gender differences, but on average, we generally even out across the curve, so to speak. And you see a lot more research coming out now to suggest that where it's our expectations that differ or our beliefs that differ, not necessarily always our behavior or our abilities. Um, so the hard thing about not asking that question is sometimes that is already ingrained in children. So what you see also is that young men are asked a lot about their finances. So they're given, a lot of questions about counting and a lot of questions about money, whereas women or females, young females are not. They're also rewarded for more of their stereotypical feminine behaviors, whereas men are rewarded more for their masculine behavior, or young men are. So it's difficult to disentangle because it's so ingrained in us and conditioned in us from a very young age.
Hmm. Well,
That's not either.
sorry.
Just so that's not to say it can't change either, or there aren't things that we can do to change that. but it is something that will take time and takes sort of another shift in conditioning or learning for us to overcome some of these associations that we have.
Well, I think we could probably spend hours talking about this, but if anybody wanted to learn more about your Superstar of STEM program, where should they look?
So you can go to the Science Technology Australia website, or if you literally just Google Superstars of STEM, then there's a lot of information that comes up about the program. So they're very well um, positioned online. Someone can reach out to me as well, and I can always put them in contact. If someone is in Australia at the moment, actually they're opening up for the applications for their next cohort are available. So yeah, really strongly recommend people reaching out. The other thing that I might mention is if you want to try and maybe shift your own perceptions of behavior so that you can ensure that you're more inclusive, some things to think about is actually keeping yourself accountable or in check. So by thinking that you're less biased, maybe I'll position this better. What we see is that even if you're aware of your bias, or that if you do de-biasing training, this actually doesn't always work. So because we're often continuously biased. So one thing that I might suggest for people, if they'd like to also keep themselves accountable for having more inclusive practices, is think about ways that you can put metrics to or track your progress in certain ways. So when I was recently listening to a talk, I heard media say, "What can we do?" I thought you can literally look at how many men have you covered in the media, and how many women have you covered in the media? How many meetings do you have where you're speaking equally to both men and women, or promoting both men and women equally? So there are ways that we can put metrics behind our actions to ensure that we're more inclusive.
So nudge us or nudge ourselves to equality. What's the word I'm looking for here? Nudge us to equality.
And make it observable for yourself and others, so that you can keep track of it, as opposed to just being subjective, because we all think of ourselves much more favorably than sometimes our behavior actually shows. So this way it keeps us accountable.
For sure. So great tips, and thank you for covering it. And for those that are interested, I'll put a link in the comments above, so you can go directly, or you can Google it as Juliette suggested. So if we could transition ever so slightly, why is it important? Why is that shaking of the hand, breaking of the bread, so to speak, important for trust building? And to kind of conclude that question, given that that's not really possible right now for most of us, what can we do to build that trust without first having been through that routine or that song and dance?
So, in thinking about the first question, it's about building rapport with people as well, and building a relationship. So we like to actually do business with people that, generally speaking, we don't always do this, but that we associate ourselves with or find similarities. So we have this kind of affinity bias, it's called, where we often interact with people who we feel are similar, or that we have built a kind of relationship with. So when you meet people face to face, you're able to a build that rapport, but also b actually evaluate them somewhat. So you get more visual cues to determine if they're a trustworthy person, if you want to do business with them. There's just more opportunities to kind of learn from somebody. Now, there are the two other kind of areas here that are linked in, and that's what you get is a level of greater transparency, which, as I said, more kind of visual cues, and a level of reciprocity, which is, when you give something, people will give it back. And that's actually really tied into your second question, which is, what can we do now that we are not face to face with individuals? And the behavioral science research suggests that there are still ways that you can build A, transparency, and B, reciprocity, because both transparency and reciprocity build trust with other people. So when I say transparency, that's actually being a little bit more open with individuals. So, or being more open as a company. So, if I can give some examples, there's a famous researcher at Harvard University, so Ryan Buell, who does a lot of work in trust and transparency. And what he found in a in a restaurant setting was that if people can view chefs cooking, then they'll actually pay more for the food and they'll have a better experience. So they'll rate their experience much more favorably. And so what it was is that the more transparent that you can see the food being made or the chefs being, the more that you valued that and trusted it. And that's been replicated in airline websites and a range of other settings. I know that it's also been looked at in banks. So if you can present credit card trade-offs, so not just the benefits of credit cards, but also the problems with the credit cards or the trade-offs, then that can actually help people make better decisions, but also builds trust. In a social setting, I'm sure we've all been at a lunch before where someone has shared a little bit of information about themselves, and then we've shared a little bit of information about ourselves, and then they have. And so you felt the impact of transparency and how that can build trust in a relationship. The second part that I was speaking about is reciprocity. And this is driven by a lot of sort of a researcher called Cialdini, or his surname is Cialdini. And it's just looking at the more we do things for other people, we feel this innate need kind of to do something back, so to reciprocate. And there's been quite a lot of fun research about this as well, where you see in restaurants again, this is by a researcher called Michael Lynn, that if you're a waiter or a waitress and you come to a table and you provide them with so it's done in the US, I should say, where tipping is something that's expected to some extent. If you were to provide people with one chocolate, they are more likely to tip and tip higher than if you provide them with no chocolates. But if you provide them with 3 or 4 chocolates, they're much more likely to tip higher than if you just provide them with one. So the more kind of generous and that you can be in your behavior, the more likely people are to reciprocate. And that again builds trust. And you see that not just from money, but from physical actions. So the more that you can do something for somebody, the more likely they are to build trust with you. So if you can go and pre-fill things for people, or just save them the work, give them a little bit of additional help or guidance, then they're much more likely to help you out in the future and have a better relationship with you.
Basically, what you're describing is if you focus on transparency and reciprocity, give to get, and talk about the pros and the cons of working with your product, like the example you gave in the credit card example, you can build trust without needing to shake a hand and offer a drink or have a meal.